Hey guys, Technoman here with the video for you guys. In today's video, we're going to be comparing the iPhone 11 with the iPhone XS Max in a head-to-head comparison where we look at the hardware, the software, and the overall build between these two phones, whether you're upgrading from one to another or in the market to decide which one to get and which one might be worth getting in 2021. These two phones are really hot right now, and we want to break everything down for you guys that you need to know before you make that decision. But before we go ahead and get started with today's video, if you guys are new to the channel, we do a lot of tech news reviews and giveaways, so make sure to hit that subscribe button. Also, if you guys are in the market for one of these phenomenal devices at a discounted price, make sure you guys check out the link in the description section as well. So let's talk about these two phones. The first thing we want to talk about is the release date of these two phones. The Max here was released in 2018 along with the other regular XS or the XS version of it, which was pretty much a better probably comparison to the Max, to the actual 11 here, because the 11 here also has an 11 Pro Max, which would probably compare with the XS Max here. But this one, we're comparing the 11 here. The 11 is not to be confused with the 11 Pro or the 11 Pro Max. Those are two completely separate phones of the iPhone 11 lineup. The iPhone 11 here is actually the cheaper version of it, unlike the iPhone XS, which is the premium lineup where it starts at $1099. The iPhone 11, when you buy it new at the base model, is $599. So almost $500 difference between these two phones. And why is that the case? Well, a lot of reasons why that's the case, and we're going to talk about the features why that is. But before we do that, let's take a look at the actual build of these two phones. You'll notice if you hold them side by side, these phones look pretty much like they're about the same in a lot of ways, but there's differences. Of course, the size wise, you'll notice the XS Max, of course, is a bit bigger in the body space size compared to the 11 when you hold it side by side. You'll notice things like the lens of the actual camera. Both of the phones does have two 12 megapixel back rear camera, but with the 11, you'll notice these are rounded where there's a separation versus all the dual ones on the XS Max here together. The flash here dragged out a little bit where the flash here is in the middle. You also notice things like the bezel here on the white part on the 11 popping out, like the iPhone lens here that are popping out. Things like the Apple logo on the 11 is in the mid versus on the more towards the top on the Max here, and the word iPhone is completely gone from the iPhone 11 here. This is not a fake iPhone, it's a real iPhone. Apple started to remove pretty much any writing that they had on the newer iPhones out on the market. Other things to note, of course, the bezel here, of course, the build up between these two phones. One interesting thing to note is both of the phones do have for both front and back being glass, so you can do wireless charging, but the actual aluminum build or the body build between these two phones are slightly different. The iPhone 11 here is actually made out of aerospace grade aluminum versus on the iPhone XS Max here, which is built of surgical grade stainless steel. So different body build, but can't really notice much of a distance between, and that the Max here is more shinier versus the matte on the iPhone 11 build here. And if we look at the next thing between these two phones, it is the weight comparison. Because of the iPhone XS Max here just being a bigger body phone, it weighs just a little over 7 ounces, where the iPhone 11 here weighs just under 7 ounces. So if you're looking for that, you'll notice between these two phones when you're holding it, depending on what kind of hand size you hand, because the iPhone 11 is pretty much bigger compared to the previous generation of the flagship lineup. It is a 6.1 inch diagonally compared to the 6.5, so almost 0.5 length difference between it. Depends on how big your hand is. You might find that even though the Pro Max is even bigger, that the 11 does look really big to someone with a smaller hand. And of course the iPhone Max here, because it is the Max version of it, it is huge, and depending on if you have bigger hands, the Max might sit more comfortably on your hand. And talking about that, let's talk about the actual build of these two phones. Is the other aspect that both of these phones are actually IPA68 ratings, so you can take both of these phones for a dive without having really any issue. But one thing we do mention in our video, that because both of the phones are both front and back being all glass, is that if you have any sort of cracks or any compromise of the phone, if you take it underwater, you're most likely gonna damage the phone. So be very careful if you do take it under grab because of the glass, to make sure neither of the glasses are broken in any way. And let's talk about the actual display, because that was really important between these two phones and why one is almost $1,100 phone versus a $600 phone. Talking about the iPhone 11 here, as we mentioned, it is a 6.1 inch all screen LCD liquid retina HD display. So it's the liquid retina display, and it has a 1792 by 828 pixel resolution at 326 ppi. It has a 1400:1 contrast ratio, and things like true tone, wide color display, and haptic touch. It also has a 625 nit of bright hueness, similar to the iPhone Max here that we have. And the reason why this is more expensive is because it is a 6.5 inch all screen OLED display. This is the Super Retina. It's not the liquid LCD that's on the iPhone 11. That's why hence the starting price is so much. As Apple claims that the manufacturing of the OLED cost a lot in their production lineup, and this is why the display is HDR display here that we have. Other thing to note is the jump in the actual resolution thanks to that OLED. You have a 2688 by 1242 at 458 ppi, and if you're looking at the contrast ratio compared to that 1400:1, the iPhone XS Max here has a impressive 1,000,000:1 contrast ratio. And other things between these two phones, as we mentioned, both of the phones have things like true tone display, wide color display, and the iPhone XS Max here has what's known as a 3D touch versus the haptic touch on the iPhone 11. And then of course both of the phones have the same amount of brightness between these two phones. Another internal hardware thing we want to mention about between these two phones is actually storage capacity on these two phones. The iPhone 11 here has base model between these two phones are 64 gig. But one thing to note with these two phones is that they also come in the 250. Also on the iPhone XS Max here comes in 256 gig versus the 128 gig on the 11 for the base or the medium grade model. And at the highest end of storage between these two devices, the iPhone XS Max, you can get it in 512 gig versus on the iPhone 11 here it only goes up to 256 gigs. So if you want that higher end maxed out storage, you will go probably with the Max here, because iPhone does not support the 512 gigs of storage. And talking about storage, let's move on to the battery life between these two phones. Both of the phones surprisingly has around 3100 mAh battery, so big batteries because of big phones. And what does that really mean? Well, when you talk about battery, one thing we cannot miss out is on the topic of video playback. That's a pretty good indicator between these two phones of how well they last, and they last pretty well. The iPhone 11 here lasts about 17 hours in video playback, where the Max here lasts about 15 hours of video playback. So 2 hours difference between it. Because of that OLED, it consumes up a lot more power, and because they have bigger battery doesn't quite necessarily mean same amount of video playback or even just battery lasting long. So those are the things to mention. And of course, the chip on these two devices is another important hardware aspect that we cannot miss here. If we talk about the chip between these two phones, because iPhone XS Max here was released in 2018. It came with the A12 Bionic chip compared to the iPhone 11 here that came up in 2019 with the A13 Bionic chip and the third generation of neural engine. And that's expected when you have phones, a year later, Apple goes about updating its chip to the next generation of chipset to make it a little bit faster. And that's the case with the iPhone 11 here. It is slightly faster when you did some comparison tests in terms of speed. So if you're looking for a little bit more speed, you're probably going to be going with the iPhone 11, because if that's your main concern between these two devices. Other thing to mention between these two phones is that both of the phones hold up really well in a lot of ways that we mentioned. Is the other aspect that goes into is the camera, and both of the cameras, as you saw, have that 12 megapixel rear camera, and that's where a lot of the differentiating factor comes in. If you're taking photo between these two phones. They'll have both of your, most of the popular feature. They'll be able to zoom both optically, both ways, up to 2 times the zoom. They both also have things like the portrait mode. You're able to do the almost similar settings in your portrait mode. They have panel mode. And then video, of course. Both of the phones are actually able to record from HD to 4K at 60 frames per second. So a lot of similarities there. One thing to note between the two phones is the iPhone 11 actually has a better features in terms of camera. A couple of the features that aren't available on the Max that's available on the 11 that we'd like to mention is night mode and diffusion for better optical imaging, of course. And it also has the next generation of smart HDR, so slight improvement from the iPhone Max here that we don't see here. So that's another thing to mention. And let's talk about the FaceTime camera between these two phones, or the front-facing camera for those awesome selfies. You'll notice between these two phones, the iPhone XS Max here is able to do some phenomenal picture, but it's only limited to 7 megapixel camera, where on the iPhone on the 11 here it has a 12 megapixel camera. So if you're looking for better selfies, better FaceTime image, you're probably gonna go with the iPhone 11 here. So enough with the hardware of it. Let's move on to the software of these two phones. As we mentioned, both of these phones are actually able to update to the latest iOS 14 update, and they're supported, which is a good news for these two phones. But when it comes about software update, we want to mention about the age of the phone, because what happens is once the software between these two phones starts to age, you're going to notice that they're not supported equally, because Apple usually supports Apple phones for about 5 to 6 years on the major software update version. You're going to see the iPhone XS here probably go another 2 to 3 years compared to the iPhone 11, which is going to be another 3 to 4 years. So if you're looking to get the most run out of the iPhone, you're going to probably go with the 11, because it'll probably get an extra year or two more in terms of your software update. But good thing between these two phones is that if you update to iOS 14, both phones work exceptionally well right now, as we've seen when we were testing both of these phones out on iOS 14. So good news between these two phones. And now let's talk about why you might pick one versus the other one. Let's start with the 2018 iPhone XS Max. Why might you pick this phone versus the newer iPhone 11? Well, a couple of reasons, of course, we mentioned throughout in this video is that it has more of that display screen resolution that you get, and that's evident pretty much on when we compare the actual pixel density as well. It has a 6.526 bigger screen size. If you compare that 6.5 versus a 6.1, of course, you get about close to 40% higher pixel density. And that's really important, especially if you're using this for, image processing or playing high graphic game. You're probably gonna want to have that for a phone. And of course, other thing that we don't mention here is the actual mic. Mic on the iPhone XS Max, actually, there's 3 mics compared to 2 mics. So if something of concern, especially if you're doing recording or talking on the phone and really care about the mic, you surprisingly you notice on the older phone there's 3 mics versus the 2, of course. And the big thing between these two phones, of another that we mentioned, is that OLED versus the regular display on the 11. Pretty important aspect of these two phones. And lastly, why would you pick the iPhone XS Max? It's a bigger phone, of course, the size, and also the storage capacity you're able to get at 512 gig versus only 256 gig that's possible on the 11. So why might you get 11 besides the fact that it's a year newer than the iPhone XS Max? Well, things to consider is the actual chip on this phone is bigger than, of course, the other one in terms of testing out for speed. So if you're looking at speed purely, you almost get 10% more faster CPU on the iPhone 11 compared to the Max. You get a front-facing camera that's, of course, 12 megapixel versus only the 7 on the iPhone XS Max here, and it's a lighter phone, as we mentioned, because it's a smaller phone. It's about 14 gram lighter. You'll notice that it also supports Wi-Fi 6 compared to not being supported on the iPhone XS Max, which supports or older version of the Wi-Fi. Yeah, so those are bigger things to consider. And of course, the software update, you're going to get a year or two more out of these two phones. And these two phones, if you take a look at it right now, it's pretty much are around the same price, especially if you're buying a pre-owned device. That's why you said make sure you guys check out the link in the description section if you're looking for either of these two phones. So it comes to whether is the upgrade from the iPhone XS Max worth it to the 11. We probably say no. If you're upgrading from the 10s or the 10s Max lineup to 11, it's probably not really worth it. You're really not getting much out of it. Slight improvement in camera, but nothing really that stands out in terms of feature. But if you were to decide between these two phones, if you're going from iPhone on maybe 7, 8, something lower than maybe even a 10, you might be looking at the 11 because of the improved camera compared to those phones. Of course, a bigger battery, and of course things like just being on a supported phone for a longer time, faster CPU speed, and just the phenomenal all-screen display that it has. So there you guys have it for a review. We want to conclude by saying it's a phone. Both of these phones are phenomenal phones. Even in 2021, you can't go wrong with either of the devices. Just depends on what you're upgrading from. Between one to another, not really worth it, but from other older generation phone, 11 is probably the go-to for it. Leave a comment in the comment section if you guys upgraded from one to another or using currently one of these two phones. What's your thought, opinion, anything that you have? Put it in the comment section. And thank you guys for watching. And if you guys haven't liked and subscribed on this video, make sure you guys do that. See you guys next time.